So, as you'd expect from somebody who has got a library background, I want to talk to you today about the importance of metadata, that is, data describing your data, in the whole of data management. And metadata has been described as love notes to the future, which I think is quite poetical. So, starting with, why would you even want to manage your data? Well, obviously, managing your data will save you time and effort and heartache and pulling your hair out in the future. If you organise how you're going to manage your data at the start of a project, it will be much, much easier to tidy up your data, pack it away, give it to other people, give it back to yourself at the end. So there's lots of carrots for organising your data. It's just good research practice. The stick, of course, is that increasingly funders and universities are requiring people to manage their data as part of the research process. So the majority of the UK research councils actually require a data management plan as part of your research application. And the one that doesn't, EPSRC, requires it as a early first deliverable in anything that you're doing. So that's the carrot, sorry, that's the stick to the carrots of better efficiency for your own work. Now, what is a data management plan? Well, it's something that I'd urge that you should do regardless of whether you've got funding. It's just, again, sensible. And it should be for the life of the project, not just for the proposal. So it means that you're sitting down, you're thinking about, what am I actually going to be gathering? How am I going to store it? What formats of data am I going to have? You know, is it all going to be electronic? Am I actually going to have physical data that I have to store somewhere in the future? You know, are you going to have soil samples? Are you going to have ice cores, as we have here in Southampton, a huge amount of ice cores that we have down at the National Oceanographic Centre? You know, that has to be kept. Or are you just going to be getting stuff on paper that will then have to be transferred to electronic and so on? And how are you going to catalogue the data you collect? How are you going to keep on top of what you've got and where it is? So I would say that a data management plan is essential for any new research project, whether it is funded or unfunded. And a useful tool, if you've not come across it before, is the DMP Online tool that is run by the Digital Curation Centre, who are based out of Edinburgh. And they keep it up to date for the requirements for all the different funders, but there's also just a basic one that is not funder specific that you can use to start your own work. Some universities also have that embedded in their own research progress. So for example, at Manchester, if you're starting any new project and you want a bit of space on the central file servers, you know, you have to complete a very standard Manchester specific DMP, which they actually host on DMP Online. So one of the first things that you need to think about when you're putting together a data management plan, beyond the actual science of what am I actually going to be trying to find out, what sort of data am I going to be getting, is then where you're going to be storing your data. And unfortunately, we don't all have access to data vaults as they did in Rogue One. My children were very impressed when I told them that I looked after the data vault at the University of Southampton, and then I had to say, it's not like that one, sorry. It's just a big box in a big room. So you need to think about storing your data, what you need to store in the short term, what you might need to keep for longer term. How are you going to decide what to keep? Eventually, what will be the best format to archive the material, and where that should be, material should be deposited for long-term use. Those things you can maybe mull about more over the length of the project, but certainly knowing what you need for the short term, what you will need to be keeping at the end of the project is something that you should know at the start. So, for example, we're going to be dealing with a lot of streaming data, where actually the data that's going through is not as important as the actual algorithm that you're running over that data, in which case keep the algorithm, keep a good description of what sort of data you ran it on, how you got it, and so on. The methodology is important, the algorithm is important, the actual streaming data, not so much, doesn't need to be preserved long term. But it might take up a huge amount of space in the short term while you're analysing it. And that's often something that happens a lot of computing power required for the data during the analysis, and then afterwards very little actually needs to be stored from that. And that of course will then key you into the fact that I'm going to need lots of space, need to talk to the computing services department. Where am I going to get that space? Do I get it on central file store? Do I get it on the special research area? You know, am I going to have to buy hardware of my own? Another criterion that you might think about as to what should be kept and what shouldn't be kept. How easy is it to replicate the data? If it costs a lot of money to store it because it's quite large, but actually the bench time to recreate that data is very small, then again you might think about, well, what's the value of actually storing this again when subsequent scientists might actually just rerun the experiments, in which case very detailed information about what you actually did, having those notebooks in an electronic format so people can accurately see what you've done to replicate what you've done might be more important than actually keeping all of the results of all of the assays that you did, for example. So think about your data storage, think about what resources you may be able to get in your own institution. And remember that there is always something that could go drastically wrong. This is are various pictures from the fire that we had nearly 15 years ago. It was actually on Sunday, the 30th of October 2005. And it was our electronics and computer science department that went up. Led to the largest insurance claim in UK HE history because it had our clean labs in it as well. But fires do happen quite regularly, particularly in computing science departments, because Edinburgh's went up a few years ago as well, about 20 years ago. There are regular fires in chemistry departments, as I'm sure you're all aware. So never, ever assume that material is going to be safe if you've only got it physically in one place. So for electronic data, the simple rule is 3-2-1. Have 3 copies of the data spread over 2 types of media, 1 copy of which should be off-site. Now, if you're lucky enough to get space on your university central servers, your university file store, that is almost certainly what they are working to. They will have, you may have a local copy, then there'll be a copy on the server, there'll be a backup copy on the server. They will maybe nightly, maybe weekly, make backups to tape, and those tapes will be taken off-site. So you should have a good belt and braces approach. If you choose to store your material in the cloud, then do check out what sort of backup system is available to you there. You may find actually it's not as robust as you have been used to if you've been using university central file stores as well. And do remember that wonderful the USB sticks are, they seem to be programmed to fail a month before you need to do something vital with that data. So try not to use USB sticks as a storage solution. They are there solely as a good way of moving data around. So that's dealt with storing your data, but how do you actually find your data again? Because the first person you share your data with is your future self. So finding the metaphorical needle can all be helped to be easier if you can embed metadata in your work practices. So things like the folder structure you use, tagging in files, oh, I've got folder structure there twice, that should be file names, secondly, document registers, and your lab notebooks. So again, folder structure, there is no one true folder structure. Sometimes big flat folder will be better for the type of data you're bringing in and working with. Other times you might want a more hierarchical tree. You may have want to have your kind of working folder and then backup folders, which aren't backups like the storage backups we're talking about, but just kind of earlier versions that you can easily roll back to. Of course, with that, you could also investigate using versioning software as well, if you're interested in being able to go back to previous versions of files. Again, will very much depend on the research that you're doing. Do look into using metadata tagging within your file system, if that's allowed. So in Windows, most of the software programs, or apps as we now have to call them, will allow you to tag author, have subject information in there, as well as title. We've all had Word documents sent to us that seem to have metadata that bears no relation to the information that is within the file. So, you know, try and make sure that if you are going to use it properly. If you're not going to use it, don't use it. So don't send around something saying it's, you know, SU template for minutes, and actually it's a you know, proposal for your next research grant. File names are somewhere where we tend to embed a lot of metadata. This may not be possible if you're dealing with file names that are assigned automatically by a piece of equipment that you're using. But generally, if you're creating the files yourself, it's a good idea to have something that is human readable as well, and preferably a bit more meaningful and semantically rich than the example from PhD Comics in front of you. So it should be something that's meaningful to you, but also hopefully meaningful to other people around you. So be that your colleagues, your manager, your underlings, you know, so if somebody else were to look at it, they'd have a vague idea of what you're using. And do keep a record of abbreviations. So you don't have to spell everything out, but if you do keep a record of abbreviations, it means that you'll be at least consistent, and it will help you for when you have to do your README file for when you finally deposit your data at the end. So this is an example from the UK Data Archive. Now that's the big national repository for social science data. It still is relevant whatever topic you're doing. So in this case, somebody's used FG as an abbreviation for focus group, cons for consumers, and they have the date in a 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2-digit day. If you didn't have the information that FG stood for focus group and cons stood for consumers, you'd maybe have to dig around a bit more, look at the contents of the file to work out what it was. But if there's a README file with it, you would have known that already. Other bits of interesting metadata you might put in file names might be version information. Again, you may prefer to use versioning software that will do this for you, but if you're not, then you know, bear in mind and remember the standard versioning tools, which will be when there's a major substantive change, it's a change to the initial digit. Minor revisions are point changes. I have just mentioned dates. It is possible to put dates in file names. You can do it well, or you can do it abysmally. On the screen, I've got two examples from the University of Southampton SharePoint area. And on the left, we have a series of meetings. As you can see, it's quite difficult to see how often they happen. It's difficult to work out the order of the meetings. On the right-hand side, it's quite clear to see, looking down this list, that it's a monthly meeting, happens usually towards the end of the month, and it's sitting there nicely month by month. And it's a meeting that is always the same, so the stem of the file name is always the same, but because it's the date that's changing, then it orders nicely when you're looking at it in standard file name order on a computer. The left-hand side meetings, just to let you know, they were a weekly meeting. It was awful trying to find the right folder for the next week's meeting, and we did take action, and a couple of us went in and changed everything so we could remain sane. Now, another way of keeping on top of what's in a file is to use a version control table. Now, this might not be something that you've come across before. It tends to be used more in parts of health research. It's used a lot in kind of ethics, social sciencey type stuff. Might be very useful if there are some files that a group of you are working on. So it's not yours yourself, it's something that is common to lots of people. Now, you could use track changes, but track changes is very good for seeing what has been changed when you're in the middle of a document, but it's not good for giving you an overview of what has been touched in this document beforehand. So a version control table, as you can see here, normally has all the kind of metadata about who owns it when it was created, but then gives you a running log of who touched it when, and importantly, an overview of what they've done to it and what substantive changes have been made as you go along. So you might find that a useful tool to use. Now, that is very much looking at an individual file. So you go into an individual file and you find out what are the changes that have been made to it. Trying to get more of an overview of what files you have and where they are, you may want to use something like a document register. Now, here I've got an example because somebody sent it to me very kindly from Humanities at the University of Southampton. Again, the subject matter does not really make a difference. I have also seen chemists who have used this regularly to keep on top of all the files that they're creating. And in fact, I have a horror story from a chemistry PhD student who was keeping his log of all his files and what samples he'd used and which experiments had been run and the which files had come from which machines, and he usually made sure that it was updated, you know, by Friday afternoon, so he could leave with a clear conscience at the end of the working week. And he didn't do it one weekend because he was going away for the weekend, and he thought, I'll do it on Monday. Of course, you come back on Monday, new things, new tasks, you forget to do it. It is the greatest lie we tell ourselves. I'll remember what I did. Come to the subsequent Friday, he could not remember what he'd done the week before. Basically, all of those experiments, all of those results, because he couldn't remember exactly which file had gone with which sample, and it wasn't recorded on the files because there was some lossy metadata as things were transferred between machines, he lost a week's worth of work. So he was very good after that at filling in his document register. So in this case, they've given everything a running number. There's a code for the project, then a code for the type of file it is, and a running number after that. Then there's other bits of information, so the proper title of each file, what it actually is, brief description, the date, where it's held within their file storage system, and then you could have subsequent tags. So, for example, if it were to do with the samples, it could be, you know, the various conditions, the temperature and the properties that you would have in those tags going on. But it's a very, very flexible concept, a document register, and it has been very, very useful. So, and I've just realised there is a problem with this because, of course, I can't see chat anymore. I was going to ask if anybody knew what this particular piece of scientific data was. But I think with 47 of us, it's going to be a bit difficult to get the answer. So I'll just have to tell you. So it's from 1620. You can see the date at the very, very top. And what you have on this particular page is on the left-hand side, you have a series of dates, and on the right-hand side, you have a series of symbols. And without any further information, you may not know what that is, except it's somebody scribbling something on some paper 400 years ago. If I give you this additional information, might give you a bit more of a clue. Now you can ignore the top half of the right-hand side piece of paper. That's a draft of a letter. But this scientist, like most of us, just, you know, grab scraps of paper when ideas pop into their head, and they have started scribbling down thoughts on the observations that they have made that you can see on the left-hand side. And this is, in fact, two pieces of paper from Galileo Galilei's notebooks. So on the first piece of paper on the left-hand side, you have his data, so the observations of Jupiter and its moons. You have some metadata, which is the timing of each observation. And occasionally, he's also noted down what the weather was like. And then on the right-hand piece of paper, you've got more text describing methods, analysing, concluding what he's actually seeing. So he's going, well, I can see the dots here. I think this is the path and the orbits that these bodies are taking. So basically, if you do your data management well, you make sure that you've got data, metadata, and description, methodology. Your data should also be understandable and readable in 400 years' time, as long as you've managed to save it in a decent preservation format that we can read in that time. Vellum probably beats everything, I must admit, for longevity. So when you're sharing your data post-project, you will often be putting data into either your university repositories or more general subject repositories, or even repositories like Zenodo, and you'll normally get a DOI to say this is where the data is, and it's a DOI, so you can quote that to other people. You can quote it in your journal papers, your conference papers, you know, quick DOI, go off there, you'll find all my data. DOI doesn't actually ask you to describe the data set that you're depositing. All you have to do for a DOI is to say what the title is, say who created the data and where they were when they created it, and give a very short abstract or description of the data set, which in many cases I have seen is no more than this is the data underlying the paper published as, and then a citation to the paper. So to make sure that your data set will be understandable and readable to other people, you should always include a README file. And this is where noting all of that stuff down at the beginning, keeping a list of your abbreviations, having your document register, all makes your life so much easier. So a good README file should have who's made the data, when you collected the data, that might be just a simple year, might be a range. For certain types of data, obviously, that is incredibly important. So for environmental data, it's very, very important you know when the data was collected. And also for environmental data, very important that you know the geographic location of the data, you know, if you're taking air quality samples or soil samples and so on. Any licenses or restrictions to be placed on the data. So I'm not through that at the moment. Generally for scientific data, it's something like a CC0, so anybody else can take and reuse the data, unless of course there's human data involved. Sometimes there are more restrictive licenses on that, and you can only get the data if you've gone through certain ethical hoops. But that's not really our focus today, so I'm just going to put it in there that that's something you will need to think about, but I won't go any further. Obviously links to any publications that cite or use the data. And then rather than just assuming that those publications will have the methodology in and you know the full details for the way that the data was collected, because they won't, and you know full well that they do not. You can't look at a paper and you go, absolutely, that is the whole step-by-step method of how they've done that. Then you should have that in your README file or links to other documentation which has your full experimental design, protocols used, and so on and so forth. And again, if you've been managing your data, that sort of information should be part of your data management plan. So it shouldn't mean a lot of rewriting, it should just mean collecting information that you've already thought about and documented. This is why metadata, data or information about your data, is really a love note to your future self. Obviously, mention any equipment that you've used in the data collection. You know, if you're using a particular type of machine, say what it is. If it can be calibrated at different levels, say what that is as well. Again, relationship between the data files. For each file or directory, you should have a short description of what it contains. Now, obviously, in certain types of data set, you don't need to do that down at file level. It might be enough to say this directory contains this sort of data, you know, collected on the dates as shown in the file names and so on and so forth. And so that's why you have also for your tabular data, any codes and stuff. So all of that stuff that you've collected as you've gone along as part of your data management plan should be coming in to your README files. Something that you should be aware of is that there is this thing called interoperable metadata that computers can read. Some of that is very general, some of it's very disciplinary specific. Again, you could have a whole session for hours on interoperable metadata. I don't want to talk about it. I just want to make you aware that it's there. And of course, metadata is only one part of making sure that your data will be accessible in the future. You need to think about file formats. You know, if you're using something proprietary, can you save it out to non-proprietary? Can you save it out to some extensible format? Does your university offer a preservation layer? Increasingly, more and more universities do. And a preservation layer will help with things like bit rot, because it will go and do regular checks on that. And there's some of the file formats that you can save out to. There is a whole list of them at, again, the UK Data Service that are recommended for archival data, not necessarily data that you will be using during your own working time on your research. This is all for kind of saving it so somebody else can pull it out and look at it again in the future. So, ready for questions?